A couple of things worth mentioning before we move on to the next step of epoxying these outside pieces to the foam cores. Number one would be straight building boards. Check your boards. The other thing is checking these cores at this point with the plywood on one side. After it's released, it is not perfectly straight when I hold it up to the light. If I look down it and feel of it, there's still some flex in the foam cores. To me, this is a stress skin structure, and when we get sheeting on all four sides, it's going to become very stiff. It's going to be critical on the next step when we epoxy these outside pieces on, that we again weight it down flat on the board while it cures. The other thing is I have a little bit of epoxy that has oozed out on the edges, so I'll have to clean these edges off before we do the next hot wire cuts. Also, all these pieces for the sponsons were completely cut out from the sheets, so there were no tabs to sand off. The manual recommends wax paper on your board. I taped freezer paper down with the shiny side up, and it looks like there's no epoxy left on the paper. It released beautifully. Everything came up with the sponsons. So I can put these back on this same freezer paper. It'll be flat on the board when I do the next step. Thinking for these, as far as trimming the edges for hot wire cutting, I'm going to put epoxy on just one surface. It's going to be these wood pieces. We'll have a big bead of epoxy oozed out onto the foam that I'll have to trim off. That's for this one. Square end to the back. I'll line these up so I can weight both of them down at the same time. Just going to get epoxy on your fingers with this operation. No way around it. So since I put epoxy just on the plywood, I'm going to work it in like this to the foam. Again, they're basing everything off the back edge of the sponson and then taping them down. This one has to go on like this. Less curve on the bottom, more on the top. Here's the top curve on the sponson. More curve. Work the epoxy in. Now we'll weight it down. Just as I expected, nice straight sponsons, no flex. You are not stretching the plywood on either side epoxy to the foam. Stress skin construction. So stiffen right up, putting the other side on. Let's take a moment to appreciate the beauty of this process. Zippkits design. Start off with 2 square blocks. The insides are the same. So we put an inside on both sides of the square piece of foam, established top and bottom profiles. Then we took these top pieces and we did the same thing. 2 pieces, top and bottom, they're identical. We offset them to the scribe line so that when we glue them down, we'll have a little excess to sand off. Now we have these side pieces on here, and we have a nice straight inside edge. And now we're going to wire the top angle and the bottom angle. The bottom pieces are the same way. They figured when we get that angle, we're going to have a little extra to sand flush. So simple and effective for making nice, accurate sponsons. Next thing, I have this little bit of epoxy that has oozed out that I need to trim off. And I'm going to trim it off and sand it, but for a telltale, I'm not going to sand off the burnt edge completely on the laser cut plywood. I'm looking at the outside pieces where I only applied epoxy to the plywood, not the plywood and the foam, and it looks clean. It would be a bigger chore to try to trim epoxy off of here and not undercut the foam. In other words, I need to lay the wire from this edge up to this edge when I wire these top and bottom angles. So I use a controlled amount of epoxy, and I don't have any cleanup to do on the outside pieces. I have this sponson ready for the hot wire. What I'm doing is number 11 X-Acto. I'm cutting off the epoxy that's sticking up because it's gummy, it doesn't sand. I'm holding this level so I don't gouge into the wood, and cutting down to but leaving the laser cut. Then, since we're going to be holding the hot wire at an angle, cutting down to this piece of plywood here, any epoxy that's into this seam here a little bit, I'm taking the tip of my knife, not tilting as much as the angle the wire is going to be on, but a little bit. I'm actually cutting into the foam to get that epoxy out. I don't think the hot wire is going to cut the epoxy. I think it'll just bounce over it. So then when I get it down like that. Then I'm taking my sanding block with it tilted a little bit into the foam and sanding that surface to get a smooth surface for the hot wire to ride on, but still leave my telltale laser cut. So I'll get this one finished up and we'll get on to finish up with the foam cutting on these sponsons. Let's finish up these sponsons. Lovely. Left and right. Top and bottom angles. That made for a very nice smooth cut. See how it cut below the plywood on the inside? And anywhere that there's a bit of a void where I've cut in a touch, we'll fill with epoxy. The final steps on the sponsons build will be to sand these angles into the plywood on the sides for a better glue joint. Then bond the top and bottom skins on, sand them flush, and then end caps and nose block. The instructions say before sheeting to sand the backs of the sponson square. And then if we line these up, it's flush across the back, square to the center line. We align the center piece of plywood. We look at how accurate both curves, top and bottom, are, how they come out. And then it says to sand these square and same length. So they're squared off. And the first thing we're going to do is sheet the bottom, and we're going to leave the bottom an 1/8 inch long. That's how Zippkits does the trailing edge for water coming off the back of their sponsons. Use as much tape as it takes and look at the seam. If you squeeze it and epoxy uses out more tape. These are bottom skins. I centered them front and back. Got my 1/8 inch laser line lined up with the back. I went in with a small screwdriver under the tape, scraped out the epoxy that oozes out, and right in the front is a bit of a problem area, so I'm using these clamps here. Tape is cheap. Look at all the seams for the joints and make sure they're tight. The top and bottom sheeting is sanded flush. Transoms are on. Everything's flush. Got my 16th overhang. Was an 1/8 inch. Now it's sheeted with a 16th sheet. When I align both of these sponsons up, if I line them up in the back, even with a straight edge, nice and square, and top and bottom, I line up in the back and in the middle. I feel with my fingers, very accurate sponsons. I have these sanded flush, so ready for the nose blocks. And if I look at the top and bottom contour, how it matches all the way down. Perfect. The power of CNC driven laser cut sheeting, and then following with a hot wire cutting of the foam to the laser cutting. I've also started on blueprinting the bottom sheeting on the sponsons, sanding it flat. Most important is the ride pad area, probably up to just past halfway. I went all the way up to the front. I am close enough to being flat at this point where I believe I can blueprint the rest of it in the clear coat. And mostly I don't want to sand any more where you cut through to the next layer, which will be a dark layer, because I want to keep my options open of leaving this blonde. Haven't decided on my color scheme yet. The nose blocks are epoxied on and they've cured. I'm going to get these roughed in with a saw and sanded to shape. Yeah, I like that. It is a tapering radius. So I have a full radius on both sides of the nose block. And that completes the sponsons build. on the Zippkits G30.